everybody on the same page and thinking. So that's why we invited counselors, coaches, as well as social workers and sites, hoping that we kind of get everyone who's a part of the puzzle along the way. A couple weeks ago, a few of our math people had a chance to meet with Heidi. Heidi's from the Wisconsin RTI Center, and based off of that, we kind of morphed into what this meeting might look like. So we're going to get some general information about the RTI process and hopefully tie it into where Whitnall is at. And then from there, our school sites are going to provide some information so that you have some clarity around what exactly is required if we have a student who's moving on the continuum and looking at a referral for special education. And then we'll have an opportunity for some general discussion at the end. So let's see, anything to add? I'll kick it over to Heidi.
All right, so we're wrapping up this part about 9:30. Is that?
That's our goal.
I mean, my part?
Yes.
All right, cool. All right, so welcome everyone. I'm Heidi Erstad from the Wisconsin RTI Center. As Jackie was saying, we're going to go through just kind of quickly to make sure we're all on the same page. When I say RTI or you say RTI, we're all thinking about the same thing. So I want to introduce you to just one way, just a framework for thinking about how we can serve our kids' learning needs within what the Wisconsin RTI Center now calls an equitable multi-level system of support, which is a mouthful. So you're going to hear me use the words RTI and equitable multi-level system of support interchangeably today. So I'm thinking about those two as synonymous, as the way that we as a system serve kids. So just a quick information about the Wisconsin RTI Center is that our mission is really to help build the capacities of schools to be able to create those systems of support in order for all kids to achieve success. We used to use this as our model, but we now use this as our model to show that you can see that those pieces, those key pieces are still within the center of this framework, but we also recognize that there's pieces that need to be in place to support the implementation of that framework. Things like strong shared leadership, things like systemic implementation, things like family engagement. So today we're really going to focus just on this middle piece here of what does it mean, what do our processes look like when we're talking about high quality instruction, collaboration, strategic use of data through an equity lens. So those are the pieces I'm going to share with you and we'll walk through today. So here's what I hope that you take away from this brief presentation is just an awareness level of what an EMLSS, an equitable multi-level system of support is. And by awareness level, I'm thinking somewhere between like kind of those Bloom's taxonomy of remembering, understanding pieces. So be able to explain this to somebody else. And we're going to do that. I'm going to know that you've gotten there. We're going to create a rough draft, a rough sketch of your current system of supports, and then we're just going to close up with some takeaways that you want to bring with you. So everyone should have one of these. I'm going to just pass these around. I don't know what norms you have. Do you have some set norms as coaches?
For our coaches,
for your coaches meetings you do? Are there anything like the ones that we have up here? Yeah, so you're pretty close to those? Okay. So just briefly some norms to help to set the conversation tone. Just noticing that we all come to this work from different perspectives. So we want to make sure that there are some things that we have some strong beliefs around. So you just want to recognize that and stay curious. Just keeping an open mind. Trying to engage fully with our ears, eyes, hearts. I know that some of you have some technology, and that's awesome because different people have different styles for taking notes and such. But we want to just make sure that we're focused on Speaking your truth without blame or judgment is speaking from your own experience and recognizing again that we all come from different perspectives. And then accept and expect non-closure. So this is just a very brief introduction to this work, and this will take up time to implement. So we just want to recognize that. Can you give me a thumbs up if you're okay with those? Okay, so we're going to just jump into some content here. So when we talk about, and I talk about RTI, we're not talking about another place to send kids. Okay? It's not a new way of doing old business. We want to think about RTI in a different way from the legacy practices that we inherited when we came into a school system. Is if we have a student that doesn't meet or fit in this bubble, then we have a bubble where we can label a student and provide some services to them. Just want you to turn to an elbow partner, or we're going to keep this really brief, let's say 30 seconds, and identify what are some issues with serving students this way? What are some things, what's problematic about serving students this way? So just turn to an elbow partner and come up with some thoughts that you have about that. Let's just do a quick whip around. If we could just hear an idea from each partnership here. And if you've heard one that you were going to say, you can say a different one or just say pass. Okay, so we'll just start over here. What's one thing that's problematic about this way of serving students? And then just keep going around the circle.
We talked quickly that this model would lead to teachers feeling not responsible for all the kids, or could lead to them.
Okay, so my kids, your kids? Okay.
The same thing, it kind of, at least there's a lack of differentiation in your classroom sometimes, where they think that my interventions are going to take my lower level kids, so I don't need to differentiate towards those level.
So kids' needs will be met out here.
I'm echoing exactly this because that's the exact problem I'm running into, is that a lot of people think that the idea behind RTI or multi-level system is that I don't have to do it here because there's somebody who can do
Thank you.
I was explaining the way where I'm working on a 504 situation right now, which is the case. It's like, again, it's a knowledge piece. And I like that word you had used, discomfort. In the beginning, there's some people that being comfortable with it. What does that look like? And what does that look like? Support. Support not just be an educational piece for a collar. You know, this is what it looks like, this is what it sounds like. And I'm looking to make your life harder and more challenging. But cleaning up a level of discomfort through knowledge.
So there's some comfort in this. This is the system that we all grew up with. Or many of us, I shouldn't speak for everyone. Many of us grew up with a system like this. And I know that I, as an educator, have been used to, if I needed support for a student, that was something I found outside of the classroom. Did I capture? Okay, good.
I think I read it wrong. I was thinking what happens in the general education is that not all the needs are met, even when we do take them out. They're still not met, because they all have different needs.
Yeah, I don't think that you're reading it wrong. Okay. So are you pointing to the, when you said, tell us how you got to that conclusion?
Well, I thought you were asking, in general education, what are the concerns still in general education? Well, kids aren't maybe in special ed or ELL, but they still have concerns, they're still concerns.
Hey. Let's keep going. What are some other concerns?
Was it our turn?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. We said a lot of times you have kids that fit more than one bucket.
All right. Can I have an IEP and still have gifts and talents?
And be from Venezuela.
And be from Venezuela?
You pretty much said what has been said. Also, that idea of departmental services gives parents the idea that kids such as are those identified as gifted and talented should be serviced, not with all the other children.
So there's some status associated with these groups as well. Some high status, some low status. Anything else?
We kind of said the same thing, but as I say, kind of this longer, the word, that group of ineligible really kind of doesn't sit well with me. Just the defining, like if a student has needs, but then they don't need some kind of arbitrary cut point, now they're just ineligible for any type of support, and we just say, it makes it sound like, oh, well, sorry, we can't offer you anything. So that doesn't sit well with me.
Anything else to add to that?
No, we were.
Yeah, you're all together, sorry. Okay. I'll just add one other piece that comes to mind is that there's also competition. It breeds some competition for time, for professional development, as well as collaboration too. So if we're working in different silos, it's hard to find places where we're not competing for that same use of time, knowing that time is so limited in schools. So what we're talking about is creating a system of supports where we're systematically, we're thinking about ourselves as a system and how we can provide different levels of intensity of supports to students along a continuum. Okay? So when I say RTI, this is what I'm picturing. And I wanted to just share with you this roadmap that we have in front of you here. Did everybody get a copy of that? It's just a way to conceptualize what that looks like as we play that out. So this morning, we're going to spend a little bit of time, we've got 20 minutes, so we're just going to get started in this. Just to walk through what some of the pieces of this process look like. So we're thinking about ourselves as a system. Starting with identifying what are those college career readiness, civic readiness outcomes that we want for our kids. And then designing our system to make sure that everybody can get there. So it starts with being very clear on what it is that we're expecting by the time kids walk out our door, by the time kids walk out of a classroom, a grade level. So this can be used in multiple ways. And with an RTI process, we typically think about how do we screen students, so how do we find out whether students are on track to meeting that college career readiness outcome. For some students, we want to do a little bit of digging deeper. So students show that they're not on track to meeting that, or they're above where our benchmarks are. We want to do a little bit of digging deeper to see, is this a behavioral concern? Is it an academic concern? Maybe kids are absent. There could be some social emotional pieces that, or an academic enablers that are not present or unfinished learning that might get in the way of kids learning. So that digging deeper process is not for every student, but for kids that are kind of flagged through that screening process. With a better understanding of what some of those root causes are for students either being below benchmark or above benchmark, how far above benchmark, we can then be more accurate in matching our supports to needs. So we can think about where we can best serve students within our system. And you can see we've got a universal level of support, maybe you call it tier 1, selected, we call it for tier 2, and intensive. Is tiers the language that you use? So within each of those tiers, we want to think about what is our instruction, how will we collaborate around the data and instruction, and then what data are we going to collect to make sure that the processes, the instructional pieces that we put in place are effective. Does that make sense? Okay. So I think for me, this is one way to explain to parents, to teachers, to schools, what we fill in these boxes here is really our RTI system. Okay? This is how we think together as a system. Down at the bottom, you can see we also need to have in place leadership and organizational structures to make that happen. So things about professional development and schedules and action plans, those kinds of things, in order to make this system function. We also want to think about family engagement and cultural and responsive practices throughout this process. So today I'm not going to talk so much about family engagement, but we will talk a little bit about what are some processes around equity that we want to be thinking about throughout this process. Questions before I move on? And my battery's dead. Okay. So what I want to start with is just looking at that piece around equity, and I just want to share with you, I'm not going to share some practices, but I want you to think about some of the language that we use when we talk about, what's the nature of our language when we talk about kids and families within this system. So this reminds me of what you were saying about ineligibility, okay? So we want to be careful about how we're not, as we move from a legacy system of having bubbles of support to a system where we're serving all kids, that some of these can be indicators that we've got feet in both worlds. Okay? So we want to try to avoid words like placement, because we're providing supports to kids as they need them. So it's not a permanent place for kids. That ineligibility piece, that we want to provide kids the supports that they need when they need them. So if we say kids are not eligible for additional support, that's sending a message that we're only serving some of our students. The one about being too young to be identified as gifted, if a kindergarten child comes in reading, then we want to provide instruction that meets that child's needs without having to have a label to meet that needs. And that piece about only having enough spots for, we want to think about how that also is conveying that message that how are we going to meet all the kids' needs along the continuum. The other piece we want to be careful of is that we're labeling the supports that we provide rather than the kids that we're serving. So here's an example. Here's Dion. And these just represent, Dion, he comes to school, he's good in science, he's fine, his behavior's fine. But he has some reading needs, and he accelerates in math. He's at an accelerated pace in math. So it would be hard to describe Dion as a tier 3 kid, right? Because he's a complex individual, he's a whole person. But we can say we can provide Dion with tier 3 supports or intensive intervention. Does that make sense? So we don't want to try to add another label to students within this system. And then finally, I want you to think about the nature of the conversations that we have around kids when we're discussing problem solving. Whether we're talking about kids underperforming or whether the system's underserving. And Anthony Mohammed talks about what's the nature of our team discussions. Are we mostly describing and deflecting, or are we inspecting and reflecting? So what are the changes in adult practices that we can use to have a difference, make a difference with what kids' outcomes are? Does that resonate? Okay. All right, so when we think about equity, I'm not really talking about do these practices right now, but just thinking about what is our mindset when we're talking about kids and their families. Okay. Take 30 seconds and just share again with your elbow partner just one piece you're thinking about right now.
So it can't be used for the battery started. What are the students? Just agree with these, but I'm going to I see a
So I apologize. Okay.
not all of them, certainly. And I see so especially the second.
Let's finish up your current thought, please. I would like to hear just from two different groups about something you shared. What's an insight or something that you shared?
What did you ask me?
Just, I'd like to hear from, thank you. I'd like to hear from just two different groups about maybe an insight or an idea that you shared.
We talked about just being more diligent on our part of using that verbiage. I took a picture because I forgot already, but it's under saying the green work, underserving, and then inspect and reflect. When teachers are maybe complaining about students, being able to use that verbiage for our conversations.
And some schools I know have included that as a norm for their team conversations. Is that one of us is just going to be, all of us are going to be aware of that, but somebody on the team is going to call out. Sounds like we're describing and deflecting without it being a blame or a judgment. It just, this is what it sounds like we're stuck in. How can we move to inspect and reflect? So that can be a norm too. Anyone else have something? I said I would hear from two groups, so I'm going to hold us to that.
We said, and it's along the same lines of, my brain is stuck in the universal piece because it feels like you just have a lot of teachers who are in that describe and deflect. And whether they just are fearful that they are not qualified or they are not able or whatever, we do have a pretty pervasive mindset of, I will go as far as I feel like I need to go, and then somebody will come and do the rest. So we limit ourselves by default by not saying the goal of the end is to never let these kids leave tier one. That's your job, is to not let them out. Then I don't think we think of it that way.
So being inclusive that way. And then our supports can come in.
Yes.
To the class,
Yeah.
co-serving.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so we just have a few minutes left. I want to just walk through having to do a little bit of conversation about some pieces in this, within this framework. So we're just going to start with high quality instruction as you see it across the tiers. So we goes down this way. So thinking about what are the characteristics, are we able to come up with and describe what the characteristics are of each of these that we hold each other accountable? We all hold each other accountable to. What are those mutual agreements that we have that are guarantees that are universal, that are guarantees that are selected and intensive levels of support? Okay. So as we think about, and this goes back to what you were just saying, like all the other tiers really depend on having a solid tier one in place, that everything stems from that. So whether you think of reading or math, we want to be thinking about where do we provide supports for students along this continuum of support, and where does that, how do we help broaden that reach of the university to meet more kids' needs? Okay, how do we intentionally provide that instruction support? So I want you to think about, I'm going to just skip through these for a second here. So So let's just take a minute, and literally a minute. So pick either reading or math, and then talk with your elbow partner about some of these questions here related to this part of your system. So what are the research-based strategies that we all have agreed to use within the universal, within the selective, within the intensive system? How are standards progressions used to help us connect those levels of support together, whether that's for reading or for math? Okay. How do we intentionally intensify instruction as we move through levels of support? So just have, again, just a conversation with your elbow partner about what you know about your system and start to jot down some of those ideas or just have a conversation about those.
Much better. Please finish up your current thought. So I'll just share this as a strategy that some teams use to make sure that we're all working off of the same framework. So I've seen some schools use this map that you have as just like, let's put this out on a big sheet of paper and see what we're all in agreement on so that we can hold ourselves accountable to what we say that we want to do. It also helps with that communication piece between the universal and those who, if you have different people providing different service levels of support, it also helps with that communication piece. How does this connect to this, connect to this? So we can connect to see that flow. So it also can be a good communication. Does that make sense? So just
Can you go back to that slide?
absolutely,
Just
yep.
Take a few minutes to kind of read
Yep.
that.
I'm sorry, we don't have that kind of, no, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. And I shared this.
We only have enough spots for, each slide to have.
Exactly. I shared the slideshow with Amy, so she can send that on to you.
Yeah, I know, if I'm not thinking about it now, I'm worried that I'm not gonna think about it later.
I hear ya. Is there one particular question that you're?
No, I'm just kind of absorbing the questions.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot up there, so.
I think one of my observations is that like universally, like we have some definite like building things going on to like, make those instructional practices. I think where we we fall behind is when we get to the point where I need to like do something when I'm in the classroom rather than thinking about someone else doing it or it happening at a different time. But collaboratively, I do see gains from you guys as coaches as you're going through coaching cycles. I do see that like you're definitely providing teachers with ideas and strategies that could help them to do that in the classroom. So I think we're caught in this weird, it's not like we're stale and we haven't hit any of those points. You're trying to get them to buy into some of the ideas that you're giving them through those coaching cycles. So it's kind of triangular in how it happens.
For sure, and teaching can be one of the most, classroom teaching can be a really isolating experience unless we have some of those collaborative structures in place. And to break through some of that old way of doing things, like this is my classroom, this is your classroom.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
He's allowing us to go on. Thank you.
I just needed a minute to read this.
So I was granted 5 more minutes of time, so we're going to move on to collaboration and just thinking about those structures that we have in this process of matching supports to needs, as well as just how do we collaborate among classroom teachers, for instance, or grade level teachers or departments. How does that collaboration happen at the universal level so that we can talk about this together? How do we collaborate around students, individual students at that selected level and that intensive level? So what kind of structures do we have in place here? So I'm just going to share with you, this is just one way that to think about that is for universal classroom practices, that we want to make sure that we're talking about how do we respond to learning within the classroom. And then for kids and for individual problem solving, how do we support kids whose needs extend beyond the reach of the universal? So we want to have both of those collaborative structures in place. This is just an example from a school district of how they, this is from Wauwatosa School District. They have grade level PLCs, and this shows you some of the supports. And you probably have some of these pieces in place here. They address those questions of what do we expect kids to know, how will we know, what will we do if we don't know it, what will we do if they already do, so that there's some structure to making sure that those happen with regularity as well as with systematically. And then they have a system of individual, do you have a building problem solving teams probably, where we're looking at individual students or groups of kids and doing problem solving with that. And creating some types of plans for kids to close those gaps. So, again, I apologize for going through those quickly. So I just want you to talk again for just a minute about thinking about what teams do you have for each level of support? Who sits at the table there? When does it happen? How often does it happen? What strategies are in place so that teams know how to do a plan, view, study, act cycle? So that they know how to look at data, how to analyze it, how to do root cause, how to study it, something's in place. And also just support teams in terms of having roles, not just protocols, but who's responsible for facilitating, who's taking notes, who's the norm checker, those things. And then also thinking about how we're engaging our kids and our families within those levels of support. So those are big questions, I know. So just take a shot at one of those questions there and start to just talk about where that works within your system. What are our agreements for those at each level of support?
Right, that's what I was.
And we never adjust this for ever. Right, if you could please finish up your current thoughts.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. It really needs to be an interventional teacher.
The final one we'll talk about today is just the strategic use of data. So there's data all over the place on this roadmap, starting with what data are we looking at to determine whether kids are on track, exceeding or not yet meeting benchmarks along the way. So thinking about, this is not just a piece of data, but it's a process of understanding that. So what existing data or assessments do we have that help give us those indications along the way? What data are we using? What kind of diagnostic or existing data do we have in place to find out some root causes? So thinking about what data we're using here to understand where the concerns are or how, what the ceiling is for some students learning. Okay. And then thinking too about what data are we looking at when we sit down as a universal collaborative team to understand our kids on track. And what are we going to do on a day-to-day basis? What are we going to do on a monthly basis? What are we going to do on a long-range basis to improve that data? Okay. As well as looking at some data at the selected and intensive level. And that includes looking at progress monitoring data. So how do we know that what we're doing at the selected and intensive level is making a difference for our kids, for our individual kids, as well as how are we looking at that as a system? Do we have the right interventions in place that's closing the gaps for kids across the board? So, gosh, I'm just going to skip through those. So as we think about our screening and digging deeper processes, thinking about what measures we have as part of that, how do we collect that, how do we make sure we're doing that, do that consistently, how are we digging deeper to find out what more we need to know about students. And then thinking about that progress monitoring piece, about our kids meeting the goals that we've set for them. Will it be sufficient enough to move kids to where we want them to be in order to leave college and career successful? And collectively answering that question, do we have the right supports in place? Are kids as a group meeting their goals collectively so that we pick the right interventions? All right, dang you guys, that was a lot. So those are just some questions about goal setting and progress monitoring. So we said we were going to expect and accept non-closure, right? So I put that up there purposely. So to conclude, I just want you to just take 30 seconds to reflect on what is one major takeaway that as you leave this room and go home for the weekend and try to stay warm, what's something that you're going to be thinking about maybe differently or deeper, more deeply about what we talked about today. So just take 30 seconds, collect your ideas. And now just turn and talk and tell your elbow partner what your takeaway is. Progress management.
All right, can we hear from two people who have a takeaway that they want to share with the group? Thank you.
A little, we can't hear.
We spend a lot of time talking about students who score lower than students who score higher than tier level, but we don't often talk about tier one universal instruction.
When you say we, do you mean as a
When we get
system
together
or?
in teams, when we have teachers, data meetings, we're oftentimes focused on who's at
The
lower end,
extremes,
who's at the
okay.
higher end, but we don't.
Okay. Insight. Thank you. Let's hear one more insight or takeaway.
Can I just be point one on that, so is that inside point one? So, and that's, again, stuck on the tier one piece, because I think we are trying to clarify the RTI systems, and we're trying to be so clear about, for teachers, we're trying to clarify what we're doing to get, the data together, and what does it mean to be tier two and tier three. And we are hyper-focused out there, and we're under-focused right here. And that's, I think somehow we're contributing to our own demise, and I can't quite wrap my head around exactly what that means or how we respond to it, but that's a self-perpetuating thing. We're trying to get better at all this, and the more we spend time here, the less we're attending to this, and that means we're still hyper-focused out here and really not paying attention to this. I don't know how to do that. How do we get out?
It's complicated, right?
Yeah.
We'll give you that. It's a balancing.
Yeah, but I can take someone else's insight to that.
I would be curious about people's reaction to like taking a blank map like that to like faculty meetings. Would that help to, kind of raise awareness around like what we currently, do? If you had to sit down and they had to think about what are the universal, instruction strategies and kind of went down, would that help them to see maybe where some of the gaps are? Like the data piece, we use them at our like specific data meetings, but do we go back to data at any other, point?
Kim and I were talking about that, Jackie, around maybe even having this framework available, coming up on data meetings at the elementary school around, like, what are you responsible for, and what can we do to support building capacity to meet the needs in your classroom? And
Yeah.
So, to me, this is really hopeful.
I've seen some schools too do a gallery walk of like, here's kindergarten to fifth grade, are we working as a system? And so, there's all kinds of ways that we can, from classroom to classroom, from grade to grade. Great. I thank you for letting me dig into your tip. So I'm around. I come and meet with Amy quite a bit. So I appreciate your time, and hopefully this was helpful in just providing a clearer understanding of what that system of support looks like, and you Whitnallize it by putting your supports within these boxes here. Thanks. Thanks, Heidi. Yep.
Hey, are you staying with us?
I would love to stay with you.
Okay, yes. So that we have some discussion time, we'll be here. Every time we do that.
I can too.
I just feel like
That was on brownies. I know, but I didn't. No, that's what I love it.
We take 2 already.
All right, good morning. So we're going to go from universal right to specific learning disabilities. Just jump over all the middle. And I wish we had, all day to talk about universal and the collaborative process around that, because when we get to specific learning disability, the law around how we identify, there's not a lot of collaboration around what we're able to do or not do. There's some description there. So we were just going to talk about what that is in the law. So why you hear us say, well, no, we need this, we need data points, or we need this kind of chart. So we just have a common understanding of why Nicole and I are demanding.
Yes, we don't personally want them.
No, I don't want to make life miserable by requiring that. But so just short, very quick few minutes on the law. So some of these slides are pulled right from DPI, and then we stuck in a bunch of the frequently asked questions. We will send the slideshow. There's links to the technical guide. There's links to the frequently asked questions, and a few other things at the end. But I'll let you read that. This is the definition of specific learning disability. And sometimes I can get a little confusing with brain injury and so forth, because we may be looking at other health impairment versus, it's all based on what the child's needs are that we would be looking at. And these are the areas, the 8 areas that DPI delineates out as areas of a specific learning disability. Obviously, we talk a lot more about reading and math because we have more available interventions and progress monitoring tools around those areas. So Nicole's going to hand out the criteria pages. So what you see when you come to an IEP eligibility meeting that we are talking through to see if a student qualifies. The first part is insufficient progress that we talk about, where that requirement of progress monitoring, the data points come into play, and then we also then go into inadequate classroom achievement. And we do have to use a standardized assessment based on age norms to look at that criteria. And then also talking about exclusionary factors. We'll get into that as we move through the slideshow. And observations, if you see us sitting in classrooms or in interventions, watching kids, because we have to see what are their behaviors, are they available for learning?
So the next 2 slides are actually this criteria sheet that we're passing out. This is the criteria checklist that we are required to use at every meeting that we conduct to determine whether a student might have a specific learning disability. So it's required documentation for those of you that have been in meetings with us. We go through this page by page. It's 4 pages long. The first, number 1, the charts on this page, the first and second page, really cover the insufficient progress, and that is all the data that we get from the interventions. We will kind of talk a little bit more specifically about insufficient progress in coming slides, but we just wanted you to have this because it's required. So there we have to talk about any area that we've been intervening. We have to, as a team, determine that we administered our interventions with adequate fidelity, that the parents have been provided with progress monitoring data from our interventions. We then move into the bottom of the second page, inadequate classroom achievement. Again, we have to look at any of the 8 areas that we've been intervening in. We have to do assessments in that area. For those of you that know Lynn Chavanik, she is our diagnostician and she does the assessments for this part of the criteria. The then last 2 pages speak to exclusionary factors. That is the third part of the criteria. And that's really just asking us to consider whether there are any factors present that might be making a student look like they are learning disabled when in actuality something else is going on. So we have to consider a number of things in that area. Determining whether students have received appropriate instruction is one of those things we need to consider. We also have to include relevant behavior that we've noticed during our observations, and we have to consider any relevant medical findings that are out there. The last page is really just for whatever we consider a learning disability, everyone on the team has to sign and agree to the conclusions that we come to at that meeting. So this is just a really brief overview of this. We will dive a little bit deeper into each of the individual areas. But just so you guys can kind of see what we have to document.
Okay, so that first piece, insufficient progress. So delineated out in the technical guide is insufficient progress to SRBI, so that's scientific research-based or evidence-based intervention. And we have several of those in the district, my advanced math recovery, level literacy intervention, Sunday, I mean those are ones off the top of my head that do have research behind them. And then we need to progress monitor during the 2 research-based interventions in each area of concern. So if we are looking at reading fluency and reading comprehension, we need to be monitoring reading fluency and reading comprehension. Or math calculation and math problem solving. We would need to be monitoring the 2 areas if we're going to look at them. And then, a lot of times I've had conversations around best practice would be monitoring them where they're at so we can see, their growth. It's more sensitive if we're monitoring at their instructional level, but when we're looking at specific learning disability, we need to be looking at their progress compared to grade level peers on the progress monitoring. So if a 4th grader is, even if they are reading where a mid-2nd grader would, we still would be monitoring with a 4th grade reading fluency probe because we have to compare them to their peers who are in 4th grade.
Can I ask you a question? Why don't we monitor for problem solving for math in elementary school? We only take 1 oral test for math. We only take the comp test.
There's 2 learning to it, is it cap
Yeah, for elementary.
Well, it would be dependent on where the kid is at. But we've had, we have several 4th and 5th who also have the problem solving, but there are problem solving probes for younger grades as well.
I know that, but we just don't give them.
And that would probably be a conversation for all of us. Why don't we and should we be?
Right.
Yeah, there's nothing that says we can only, we should only be progress monitoring in one area. If both are areas of concern and the intervention addresses both areas.
I guess our problem is our intervention only addresses 1 area.
So, yes, if the intervention doesn't address problem solving,
Then why would we do that?
yeah, we would be progress monitoring in that area, because we're
Something
not technically intervening in that area.
Yeah.
I think that's probably something that we should look at, have a deeper discussion about.
Right.
So again, determining insufficient progress is we use Ames Web here at Whitnall. So for each intervention, establishing a baseline that's giving, I'll just use reading fluency as my example, 3 reading fluency probes, taking that median or middle score as your starting point. Beginning the intervention, collecting weekly or more frequent progress monitoring data. Now when we say weekly, remember this is if we are anticipating looking at specific learning disability for a student. And again, that's a bigger conversation around how often do we monitor kids and when do we move into weekly or more frequent progress monitoring. Using that baseline, and then we are very lucky our system gives us uses the least squares regression model to create a trend line against the 25th percentile of peers at that grade level. So then we need to make that comparison when we look at insufficient progress. And the interventions and the progress monitoring must happen before the standardized testing to look at inadequate achievement and prior to looking at specific learning disability. Again, so progress is there are three, when you look at the criteria pages, we have 3 discussion points. When you look at a chart, is their progress the same or less than same age peers? So I have frequently had students who their progress is the same, but their baseline and trend is still below that 25th percentile. So they're progressing at the same rate their peers are, but the line is never going to cross. They're not catching up. We want to see it moving at a faster rate. And then number 2 is the progress is greater than same age peers, but will not result in reaching the average range. So not reach that 25th percentile. So even if they've started so far below, they're making a faster rate of progress, but by the end of the 2 interventions or the end of the school year, they're still not crossing into that average range. The third, and this is a bigger conversation when we sit as teams, the progress is greater than same age peers, but the intensity of resources necessary to obtain this can't be maintained with just regular education. So we have a student who has caught up to the 25th percentile, is maybe maintaining right in that average, lower average part, but they have had 3 rounds of intervention. We've had this conversation at meetings.
Or they've had one-on-one intervention for 2 years.
Right. Would they be
Not
able to maintain
sustainable.
that if we took them out of intervention and they were in the regular classroom receiving the same instruction? So that would be a bigger conversation with the team when we're at a meeting.
These 3 decision rules are on this criteria checklist, and that table on that first page, they're the middle column. Just to kind of reference where they come into play. So for every area that we've had an intervention in, we would look at a decision rule in that area.
We just, when you get the slideshow, we just put some there's some links in there for examples of what the charts might look like around each of those decision rules.
So DPI has put together a frequently asked questions document for those of us that have to wade through all of this criteria. The link, the title is actually a link, so when you get this slideshow, you'll be able to click on that and see all of the frequently asked questions around making these specific learning disability eligibility decisions. We've pulled out just a couple that we thought maybe were the most relevant for this group and to answer maybe some questions. So the first question we pulled out was, what interventions are required by the SLD rule? And again, these are for students that we think might be on a track to a referral. So the IEP team must consider at least 2 interventions for each area of concern. We did reference another question. We've had some discussions about if a student, let's say, was receiving ABMR, we noted that, there's been some progress, but we think that a second intervention is needed. How can we still use ABMR, and how can we kind of set up a second intervention to be counted, I guess, as a second intervention? So that would be question number 21. So you can change the intensity, you can change the frequency, you can change the person that is administering the intervention. So those are ways that you could maybe use the same program but modify it to count as a second intervention. So we just kind of referenced that question. The SLD evaluation must be based on the analysis of progress monitoring data, which is why we are required to to collect the weekly progress monitoring data. The intervention must be implemented before an IEP team can make any eligibility decisions. And then the last bullet point is just kind of a couple things about the intervention. They must contain a substantial number of minutes beyond what is provided to all students. They must be implemented with adequate fidelity. They must be applied in a manner consistent with their design. And we need to implement the interventions for at least 80% of the recommended number of weeks, sessions, and minutes.
And I know this question gets sticky because a lot of times we're like, okay, so 8 weeks, so 10 weeks. Well, we can't prescribe that. The intervention and the way the intervention is designed, they lay out how long the intervention is. So the research behind, like LLI, how many weeks does the intervention say is an adequate amount of time? So we have to have at least 80% of that. So we can't prescribe, okay, we'll do this for 8 weeks if the intervention is designed for 12 weeks.
The next question, what is considered a substantial number of instructional minutes?
I had myself.
Yeah, so this kind of speaks to the question, like, how long should our intervention be? Should it be 30 minutes? Should it be 40 minutes? Again, that is something that's defined within the intervention guidelines, the manual or the guide. It may be left to professional judgment, but every intervention we're using, if it's research-based, should have that information in there. And it's the responsibility of the school district to ensure that we're properly implementing our interventions and that we are collecting the data properly as well. This is the question you were speaking to, Kelly. How long must an intervention be implemented? Again, they must be provided in a manner consistent with their design and for at least 80% of the recommended number of week sessions and minutes per session. And most of the published interventions that we use provide this information, a guideline about how long they should be implemented for. The duration of the intervention must be long enough to allow for enough progress monitoring data points to be collected to establish a reliable trend line. And that's the trend line that we get from Ames Web. And then the question 43 speaks to, well, how many data points are required to establish a valid and reliable trend line? Current research supports about 12 to 14 data points. So that's the length of time that we would need an intervention to establish a reliable trend line.
So that 80%, as long as you're fulfilling 80% of what the intervention itself is saying, is there any consideration within that? So like if you did 100% of it, is that a different consideration in your mind than the 80%? Or does it not matter at all?
No.
No, I think the 80% is more put in there due to, did it not happen because of a holiday or because of an absence or things of that sort, not like, okay, well, we only need to do it. I think it's more, because of the life factors that we can look at.
So the goal should still be to
Yes.
follow the, it's not like we're trying to get a floor kind of thing.
And we still need the 12 to 14
For
data points, regardless of whether 80% would put us at like 10 data points or something like that.
And that has changed over the past couple of years because when the law was still being formed, it was 8 to 10, and now the research is showing to have adequate reliability and so forth. The 12 to 14 points is best. Okay, inadequate. So after we look at the insufficient progress, we can then administer a standardized test. In this district, we use typically the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement or the Wechsler individual achievement test based on, we choose tests based on age and the reliability of the test for the age we're testing. So we have to look at 100 is average on each of these, and we have to see is their performance 1.25 standard deviations below that average. And this is, I know Lynn had mentioned that it's important to realize this is based on age. So, age can make a big difference if you have an October birthday versus a June or July birthday. So sometimes we're a little surprised at a score thinking since we're looking at grade level, when we're looking at insufficient progress, the standardized assessment is based on age.
No, and these assessments can't be administered until after the intervention is complete, just to get the best picture of the student after they've received all the additional intervention.
So this is our bell curve and where that student would be falling if they are scoring 1.25 standard deviation below the mean. And then we get into those exclusionary factors. So are there other elements at play here? Environmental or economic disadvantage or cultural factors. Was there lack of appropriate instruction? Which, that's where we talk about attendance. Was the child moved schools 5 times? And then limited English proficiency. Sometimes this one gets complicated when the students speak English at home and at school, but the primary language of parents in the home is not English. That's always a conversation of the team. And then other impairments. Does the student have another impairment that is causing the inadequate achievement versus a learning disability? So again, we are not, if we do as a team agree there is an exclusionary factor, we cannot identify it as a specific learning disability.
Can I ask a question? Is exclusionary factor also attendance, lack of, or?
Yes, definitely, because
Is
that would be
there?
lack
I
of,
missed it? Sorry.
well, the lack of appropriate instruction, so that's where attendance would come into play.
Yeah, it's not listed separately as like
Okay.
a factor, but
But that's a piece we bring in when we talk about the instruction. Okay, so this digs in a little bit. And if you go, I think we linked in the we just pulled slides from DPI we thought would be useful in a brief presentation, along with the frequently asked questions. We did link it in on the end, so you could dig in more to each exclusionary factor on that slideshow. And there we will send the slideshow out, and the links that we are using or that we reference on a very, very frequent basis are all on here that you can click and dig into if you want some light reading or spring break.
Can I just ask a general question? What are your thoughts about high school special ed referrals? I mean, is it something that is unusual, should be unusual, or is it common, or I just want an opinion?
I think generally most students have been referred earlier on. By the time it would be, I guess, it'd be worth a discussion that if a student had a learning disability and it just all of a sudden showed up at the high school level.
That would be unusual.
It would be unusual, yes. But I mean, there are many factors like students that transfer between many different schools, or if they've been homeschooled, or
parents elected not to have services and now are wanting services.
Sure. Okay.
Another one too that's come up is kids who are already identified but need identification in a secondary area.
Yeah.
That's happened for a couple kids.
That's true. Thank you, that was helpful.
All right. Thank you.
We have some time for questions or discussion. If you have questions either for the special services staff or for Heidi, or if there's things about RTI as we are going through this process that you would like to bring up to the group right now as things that need to be considered or things that are still unclear.
If a parent wants a child to be in the process of an SLB referral, and it's recognized very early on that the student wouldn't qualify, do you always have to continue with 24 weeks of intervention?
You know, it actually is in here somewhere, I have to find it, but if we have enough data to show that they, I don't want to misspeak, but if we have enough data showing that they are performing, how would you say, within, as grade level peers would be, you would not have to do the intervention, but you would have to go through, you would still have to go through the referral process, though.
So that means they would go through the 24 weeks if the parent was requiring it. Or asking for the referral.
Well, I think if you made it through like the first intervention,
Yeah.
and you had your data that shows they're, let's say, clearly above the 25th percentile,
Yeah.
I think you would have to, I guess, complete the referral process, and that you'd have to bring parents in for a meeting, present your data, you know, look through this criteria sheet that we passed out. I guess we've inquired to DPI before about whether we would have to do that second intervention if our data clearly shows that they're above. We haven't always gotten a consistent response to that question. I know we had one at the middle school last year where we did have to do that second intervention.
What's the, what about, for instance, a student who is non-compliant, like comes every day but doesn't participate in intervention?
Well, I mean, I think that
How
would
does
be an
that-
exclusionary factor,
That's
then
what
you'd be
I'm wondering,
looking
is
at
does
a
it fall under
possible another
exclusion?
disability area.
Okay.
Possibly.
What about
Wait,
kids?
before, I just want to add to Blake's question, because I have the same question with those kids that just
Yeah.
are not compliant.
Yeah.
But
I
we
mean, I
still
don't
have to
know,
put
but
them through the
everyone
full
has one.
intervention and collect the data.
If a referral's been made already,
No,
or
like,
just to complete?
if we see, so for example, we see very low data on a kid, they're not achieving at the same as their grade level peers, and we assign them to an intervention, and they are not compliant in that intervention, so they're either not showing up or they're not doing anything. Do we still, though, in my head, we still need to continue with a full intervention so that we have the data that says they're non-compliant and their attendance is poor? Or do we just, I mean, I would never want to just give up.
No, for sure.
I
But
think
that's,
you bring it back
that's
to
not what
your
I'm suggesting
team.
either.
No, I know you're not suggesting.
I'm wondering if it's at that point, we can tell perhaps that it might not be SLD referral, this could be behavioral for something else, or, you know what I mean, like some other intervention.
Or my lack of ability, I don't want you to know what my lack
Yeah,
of ability
of-
is.
of course it
And
could
so
be.
then, behaviors get inserted there, so defining which one it is. But I think when that situation comes up, that's when the team has to come back together to have that discussion and to bring the parents into the mix, so that you're being really clear on, what are the attempts that are being made and what does the attendance look like, what's the reaction during that time period, is it a possibility of, changing a person to see if the relationship is different, like there's lots of different things you could try at that point.
Is the process when we go through this with the, required documentation, we say that if all these things are checked, they qualify. If all of those, is this black and white? If all those things are not checked, do they not qualify? Is that the rule, or?
You have to, so for that sheet in front of you?
Yeah.
Yes, you would have to answer yes,
To
that there's
everything.
insufficient progress,
And if it is-
yes to all three, yeah.
Yeah, so if it is no in all of them, they do not qualify for SLD referral.
Back to the first question, frequently asked question number 7 does talk about if the review of existing data determines that they demonstrate adequate classroom achievement and sufficient progress needed to meet age or state grade level standards, you can move forward with an eligibility meeting. But it's something that rarely happens because typically if a parent is making a referral, there is some sort of struggle. So we will send that in, link it, but question number 7 in here sort of reviews that. It's not clear as day, so again, another team conversation, but you could move forward with existing data showing adequate progress.
So
So can I just have clarification of when the referral takes place? Because, like, we're doing intervention, but I'm not putting forth a referral for special education until after the data is collected, or am I, that's?
So
is that right?
I mean, typically, like if, typically, you know, and I'm speaking elementary because, right, you know, I work much more at the elementary building. We have already flagged and kids are already in intervention, so we are making referrals along the intervention timeline when we know it will finish and we
And
see
knowing that they're still
yeah,
below
knowing
that.
still
Student,
student.
so you're starting the intervention, and then if it looks like it's not
Yeah, if you
making
have-
that progress, then you're putting in. the
Yeah, you don't have to
referral.
wait until the intervention, second one is complete before you can make it.
Janet, in real time, it usually happens somewhere at the beginning of the second intervention.
Okay.
Because I mean, there's a whole, you know, the whole paperwork process and then the evaluation timeline is all occurring while that second intervention is occurring.
So I think, just for clarification, I think, I know that, I don't know, maybe I'm not reading your mind, but I think, like, you might think a referral has been requested by a parent, but they just really wanted to see, is there a concern? And that is why the intervention takes place, but we didn't really put forth a referral for some of the kids. Does that make sense? So a formal special education referral is not completed because we have an intervention process and we're going to see that, how that goes. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
that would,
But
yeah.
to make it really muddy, technically, if the parent requests a referral, we are obligated to take the referral, regardless of where we're at with intervention.
And for
But is
SL
it specific language that they have to say, or if they're just curious? Do you know what I mean?
We usually have a conversation with parents if they're like,
Yeah,
call and
better
say, I want my
understand.
kid, you know, I want an IEP. Then
Well,
we
what
would,
does that mean?
yeah, we would explain the process and go through that with them to make sure.
Right, and sometimes parents are like, well, I don't mean special education.
Yeah.
So, you know, it is a conversation of, well, what does a referral
Right.
mean? And if there is a parent who says, no, I want a special education referral and interventions haven't started, we still have to take that referral and say we then start interventions. It does not happen often, but specific learning disability is the only area that we can ask for an extension so we can complete interventions.
I had a question. So if a child's already identified with an SLD, has an IEP, is there anything in RTI that says the student should not receive Tier 2 intensive intervention or should receive Tier 2? Like, that water seems a little muddy for me.
So that system of support is intended to serve all students in your school. So students with IEPs are likely receiving intensive interventions for an extended period of time, where gen ed students, we might, actually, all kids are gen ed kids, right? But students without IEPs may move in and out of an intensive intervention, but typically a student with IEP.
From the special education department or just from the regular interventionist?
I think it
That's
depends on
determined
what's
at the-
written in their
That's a building decision
plan.
as to
Okay.
who's
Is that-
conducting the intervention.
Because then I heard that if they have a reading goal, then in their IEP, then they go with their special education intensive support. But if they don't,
Well, some of that depends on if you're looking at, like, if I qualified and I'm in under OHI, and now I want to look at SLD, again, the intervention just has to be done with someone who is trained in it so that you can kind of check the fidelity box. But those aren't, there's not a clear line in the sand, like, special ed will do this. I mean, because some of that depends on who has the training or where the time spots are. Not black and white.
okay.
It's just,
Yeah.
Well, because, right, if there is a reading goal written in an IEP, it could be a special education, someone with a special education license, but it could also be I'm not sure what the license is, you can correct me, a reading license.
Reading teacher.
Can also provide that service even though it's written in the IEP.
license dependent. Again, like team conversation, that's not like a prescribed.
Are you guys going to adjust if they don't have someone looking at possibly adding
No.
the rest of these?
No.
That's okay, yeah.
I guess what I'm saying, I have a specific student in mind who does have some intervention with his IEP teacher, but also comes to my intervention. So I was just curious how that works, like, he is not being looked at for another goal.
There's nothing wrong
Right.
with it, and it's really just a decision about where it fits into the schedule for everyone involved.
Like, I didn't know if there was a legal issue with me getting invested in like.
One of the ideas that we've kicked around quite a bit is kind of creating like an inventory of what are the interventions that we have, which category, what are they addressing? Because sometimes I think we get involved and we go to pick an intervention that we're going to do, and it's not necessarily what the area of weakness is. But then I was just adding some notes on here, like, the length of it, I think would be, because all of that is individualized. Number of minutes that the session has to be required to do, I think would be helpful just to have in one document, and maybe even like who's trained in those things to help bring some clarity.
One of the things that I've struggled with in the past, with referrals at the high school level is, and knowing like what area are we supposed to be looking at. And I guess kind of specific information, I don't know that. Like, I don't know, is it the parent area or you're? No, like,
You're talking
schools
difference
that, like,
between
in schools-
SLD and EDD or no?
No, like
Okay.
what area of a learning.
Okay.
Not currently, I haven't had this happen in the last year, don't worry, Kayla, I'm not talking about, no, I have, but like, and formerly, I was asked, like, what area are you looking at? And I don't know all the different categories.
So I would assume it's referencing the 8 areas that DPI defines.
Right.
And again, typically, we're looking at, reading, basic reading skills, reading fluency, reading comprehension, math, calculation and math problem solving, because we have interventions in those areas.
So, at the referral stage, do I have to specify, I mean, like, obviously I haven't done any area tests to find out, like, what are your areas?
So in the referral, you don't have to
Specify,
but you do have to then know what interventions and progress monitoring tools should be in place based on the area.
okay. So it's just, and maybe this, maybe my question is before we had necessarily interventions in place, so.
Well, that's something we're kind of missing right now that we've identified, in this process, that we're missing the diagnostic piece where we say the student is struggling, but we need a specific diagnostic beneath the screener. So they take the screener, we know they're struggling in math, we need a diagnostic that shows us which area of math they're struggling in, and same for literacy. So that's a piece we've identified as missing.
Right.
And it's something that is in our, we know it's missing and we need to solve it.
Okay. That would be helpful. Thank you. That's what I was.
Thank you for answering all my questions. I have to go out to a class. Thank you very much.
You get your needs met.
We're getting there.
So do you want to have any discussion around that gray area where you're starting an intervention, but you don't necessarily know if you're going to head to SLD or not? Because I think that's something that, that we keep hearing about, like, do I start automatically doing all of the probes and doing everything as if I'm going to intervention? I mean, with the idea that this is going to end up in a referral, or are there triggers?
Yes. I think we all struggle with that, with how do we start those interventions? Does every single intervention need to start, I know I'm just repeating some of what you said, but does every single intervention need to start with fidelity of minutes and days and fidelity of probes, you know, especially at the secondary level. Because I know elementary does, right?
Currently in reading, yes, because we use the Ames Web Probes baselines in terms of helping us decide whether a student would really benefit from that level of intensity.
Yeah.
The only thing would be our kindergarten kids, we will not do that. We're way more fluid and flexible because we're not going to be referring anyone. And then our first semester of first grade and even into second grade, so we're very fluid and flexible with our first graders. But I
We
mean,
still collect the progress
we
monitoring
do,
data on them,
yes.
but if they were still in say it's April of first grade and I'm trending just towards the 25th, we are probably going to lean towards giving you the benefit of the doubt of some extended time. So I would say for us, it's rare that we would ever refer a first grade student because of age and exposure to curriculum. So it would be a unique case. I mean, we have done it, but I mean, I think we look at a lot of other factors that are impacting their ability to progress.
I think we've also found out that our Ames Web probes are very, I don't know the right word, predictive of what we're seeing when we go into IEPs. Like we know if they're trending around at 17 or 18%. We're seeing that the diagnostic tests are also proving that. We're seeing the classroom performance is also proving that. So we do all the probes, we do the baselines, and it gives us some really good information.
I think our referral to placement rate is pretty close to almost 100% in terms of looking at SLD, right? I mean, it's in the high 90s at least, because they're so predictive. So
And
we don't make a lot
What
of
does that look
difference.
like for elementary math?
I think we struggle for elementary math because our intervention of AVMR, does not match well with the probes that we give. Especially at the higher grade levels, third, fourth, and fifth. The AVMR course, one that we typically use right now for intervention at the elementary school, has no fraction work, no decimal work, no multiplication work. And those things are hit upon in fourth and fifth grade for the probes. And so even though we can see somebody who progresses well with AVMR, might not do so well in probes because it's addressing the skills that aren't being taught in the intervention. So maybe we need to go deeper into, I guess.
And that's the same problem you mentioned at the middle school, Janelle, is that the SRBI we're using is not matching the probe we're using.
I wonder, Amy, we had a conversation about looking at Ames Web Plus because there are additional probes available in Ames Web Plus than the current version of Ames Web we're using right now. And I don't know what those are, but I think I do worth exploring. Because maybe that would, Joe, maybe address some of what you're talking about.
I know we struggle with that, with, some of, there's a lot less money for us, but then the prescription of the kinds of probes we have to use is pretty clear. In DPI, so we don't have a lot of wiggle room around, currently developed probes that we can use for SLP.
So anything that we were to look at, when we look at Ames Web Plus, anything that we were to look at, we would have to make sure we ran by you to make sure it would be an acceptable probe for referral as well.
I would assume Ames Web.
I would assume.
But we would definitely want to look at it before we decide.
So then, so go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, because I don't know the special ed law as well as, are mastery measures acceptable forms of progress monitoring?
Not when you're looking at qualification for a specific learning disability.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay.
So not that it couldn't be used, when we're progress monitoring kids when not looking at for learning disability, but it wouldn't be able to be used when we're looking at insufficient progress.
So just general outcome measures?
Yes, and it has to be, valid, reliable, time sensitive, something that shows progress in very small increments of time.
So then that's where we struggle with the secondary, is do we start every intervention with all of that fidelity in place, even though we know at the secondary level, far fewer students are going to end up on a referral track. That's where we're really struggling, is does the first, just for the sake of data and the sake of the possibility, does the first intervention really need to be, 12 to 14 data points, intervention with fidelity just in case? Or could there be some interventions that are just like a double dose extra helping because we know those kids are fine?
I think with that though, then we'd have to have a dedicated time for intervention. Because I think right now the 25 minutes, how can you do that with Fidelity? And also you have the idea where the kids should be going during that Falcon time to their teacher. So you're running into that. And then also there's 10 kids in intervention. How would one teacher in 20 minutes do them all with Fidelity?
Yes, which is exactly why we need to know how we have to sort those, so we
Yeah.
know how we need to adjust those.
Right, yeah.
Yes.
I think every intervention would outline group size and so forth.
Correct. But see, that's where we struggle.
Yeah.
Does everybody get an intervention with Fidelity for the possibility of referral the first time around?
Well, and I think some of that would be looking at, you know, the whole picture of the child. Does this really look like are you looking at exclusionary factors first before deciding, you know, the fidelity of intervention? What other pieces are at play that has caused this child to struggle? Would it be truly a specific learning disability that they have had difficulty across school years? So reviewing records to possibly determine that. Or is this, as the kid transferred schools 5 times, have they, you know, what's their attendance? What are those possible things that could be leading to a different disability, not specific learning disability? I mean, just brainstorming, you know, how would you have a conversation on whether a child should go right into an intense intervention?
And when you're on the secondary level, you have a whole another set of circumstances, like did they not test well? Do they not test well? Do they not want to test well? One-on-one they test really well, but they don't, you know, so they're referred to intervention, but it could be lack of motivation or something. It's just such an interesting area. So if you start off with Fidelity and they don't need it, then what's the exit? You know, like quickly you can tell, oh wait, no, this kid is performing one-on-one better than what he generally does in the classroom, or not taking his forward exam seriously, not taking any of his stars seriously. So then you wait 12 weeks or 24 weeks to exit them out, you know, like that sort of conversation.
Katie, do you get any, from all the districts that you work with, do you have any sense of how other districts are doing it?
Sure, that's a pretty common, especially as kids get older, their willingness to want to be part of that process. So there's actually some research out there that shows that once you get hit 4th grade, you can start to rely more heavily on the data that's existing rather than a screener. So that you can start to look at factors like grades and attendance and behavior pieces as good predictors of what students would benefit from having an intervention. So that we're not using just one single test measure as a way for students to qualify or not qualify. That's very hard. Show that they need an intervention or not need an intervention. That makes sense. And I think looking at that screening process too, if you've got all kinds of other data that says the student is performing at benchmark in the classroom, and the tests keep showing that they're not, then there's something else that we need to be thinking about besides an academic intervention. Is that, I don't know if that clarifies it, or is it a different way to think about it within that screening process?
Something to think about. I guess it's more specific around what are some other schools doing in the secondary level for intervention? How do they offer it? The concern of mine is that it's not a specific skill that a lot of my children in intervention are having a struggle with. It's a more work in the classroom, the learning in the classroom to satisfy the letter grade.
And the further
So
you
then
can
they're
drill down on
further-
that, I think the more, the more clear, like where, do a task analysis of like where is that breaking apart for kids, so we can provide supports enabling things can come into, are we providing kids those types of supports as well? How do I study, how do I organize, how do I take notes, how do I, so some of those, like I said, academic enablers that can help support what you're doing in the classroom. So it's a different type. I think what I've heard.
Tier 1, it's a stronger tier 1.
That's pretty common at secondary, are those pieces.
Yeah, I mean, if we have questions that kind of keep floating to the surface, I think we can probably just figure out ways of working on it. I think it's valuable for these two teams to meet together because we're trying to operate in the same world independently, interdependently, but looking at the problem. So I think it'll make sense, you know, checking out hopefully systems.
It's really great to have these two groups.
I would suggest too, if you use this framework, that of thinking about where those conversations start. So they don't just start at the intensive level. There's pieces within the universal discussions where that conversation starts. Like what are we seeing over time? So that might help to just map those in. So we're not thinking about two separate systems, but where it takes place within groups. I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay, we'll get a system of collaboration together here. Do you have any questions? Shoot them back and forth.
They're not really active, like there's no, I don't know how to using everything from our reading resources to support kids, but they are just another.
I think it's having a little bit of Do you see what I mean? It's like, so the two that
There was a special this isn't a teacher who was willing to do that. However, she was told that with experience that she should just change the role. She will be able to support that student that way. So like can I just, like, I know that's really mean and really blunt, but that's me. But like, remember, you stand back and say, and then I'm going to sit down.
yes, that's back in my
I know that's not yours.
yeah, that's